SNP Spokesperson Chris Stephens.
Well, thank you, Dr Huck. It's delighted to see you in the chair, and I would like to congratulate the honourable member for Shefford and Umston for leading the debate. Always like and enjoy listening to his contributions, and he follows a fantastic member of Parliament in Kate Green, who represented that constituency very well, and he did use his local authority experience, which is very important when discussing issues like this. So, Dr Huck, the related issues of cost of living in the private rented sector should be of great concern to members of all political parties, and they affect the well-being of people in each of the nations of these islands, much of which we're discussing today have centred on the experiences of people in England and Wales. So I'm going to contribute a particularly Scottish perspective to this debate, because there have been some criticisms from some sources of the SNP-led Scottish Government and how they've been handling the issue of the private rented sector. But what you'll hear from me are the views of other interested organisations which contradict those misgivings and which are supportive of the stance that's taken in Scotland. Now, Dr Huck, we're familiar with the factors which have contributed to the current cost of living crisis, though some might question how much those factors have contributed, or even if they've contributed at all. For example, Brexit. But no one, however, will dispute that the war in Ukraine has driven up the price of oil, with a consequent massive increase in domestic energy costs. Russia's de facto blockade of the Black Sea has also resulted in Ukraine's exports dropping to 1/6 of the pre-war level, causing grain prices to rise dramatically. And we've all seen the effects of that on the price labels in our supermarket shelves. And COVID has also played an obvious part in taking us where we are. Now, we know that the biggest factors in determining cost of living are wage rates and housing costs. The limits of devolution mean that the Scottish Government has no real say in private sector incomes, but for many in the public sector, nurses and midwives, teachers, junior doctors, their pay awards have been sufficient to avoid protracted industrial and strike action. Not as much as we would wish to pay, but better than elsewhere and certainly appreciated. Which brings us to the major factor in the cost of living crisis, rent prices. Different legislators within the UK have taken different approaches to dealing with rent prices. In Scotland, there were the recent changes to the Cost of Living Tenant Protection Act, taking effect from the 1st of April. With the exception of some defined and limited circumstances, those changes have included that most private landlords' mid-tenancy rent increases are capped at 3%, enforcement of evictions continue to be paused across all sectors for up to 6 months, and increased damages for unlawful evictions of up to 36 months' worth of rent will continue to apply. These measures will be enforced until the 30th of September, provided they remain necessary, but there's also the option to extend for another 6-month period, if required. As previously announced, the social sector rent freeze has been replaced with agreements from landlords to keep any rent increase for 23-24 well below inflation. This voluntary approach to rent setting, agreed with the social sector, will equate to an approximate average rental increase of £5 per week. Still a strain for many, but more manageable than elsewhere. It's this legislative approach, some has its detractors who suggest that SNP policies have harmed or unfairly targeted the private rented sector. There is, however, no credible evidence for this, leaving the detractors' motives open to question. For example, concerns are expressed by some private landlord representatives about the different approach between social and private landlords. The Scottish Government contend that a collective approach like that in the social sector is simply not possible in the private rented sector. As a consequence of this policy, the 3% increase in the average rent of a 2-bed private rented property, the most common size, is broadly comparable in monetary value to the average planned increase in the social sector. The Scottish Government continues to monitor the data and listen to landlords and tenants to consider whether the measures in place remain proportionate and necessary. The recent legislation is time limited and can only be extended with the approval of the Scottish Parliament, and in any event could not ever extend beyond March 2024 at the latest. Now, some, Dr Huck, have suggested that investors will exit when certain rent control regimes are introduced. Some political parties, Dr Huck, claim that this has already happened. But again, there is no evidence to support that. On the contrary, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Association of Landlords has stated publicly, we do need to have rent control in Scotland. I think that's where we are going and where we're going to be going. So let's add a few other views which have pointed to Scotland in its recent decisions. Crisis Scotland have told Parliament, we all know that the cost of living crisis is an emergency at the moment, and for those in poverty, that's an emergency as acute as a pandemic. And it calls for emergency measures that at other times wouldn't be considered. We absolutely support the need to do something to support tenants through that crisis. Living Rent have said a rent freeze would have a massive impact as skyrocketing rents continue to pile on top of out-of-control energy bills. Shelter Scotland has stated that short-term emergency measures in the programme for government are great news for tenants and will stop people from losing their homes. And the STUC, the Scottish Trades Union Congress, has stated that the Scottish Government is to be commended for freezing rents. When used, the powers of a Parliament can bring positive change. And it's on the use of the powers of the Scottish Parliament that I would like now to dwell, because Scotland has delivered 10.8 social rented homes per 10,000 population, compared to just 1.2 in England. That's 9 times as many. Spend on affordable housing in Scotland remains the highest in the UK. Since coming to office in 2007, that's produced 14 homes per 10,000 population, compared to 9.7 in England. The Scottish Government per capita spending on affordable housing is more than three times higher than the UK Government. In its published 2022-23 programme for government, the Scottish Government pledged to deliver 110,000 homes ahead of 2032, which is at least 70% available for social rent, and 10% will be in our remote, rural and island communities. The Scottish Government has committed a 5-year investment of £3.5 billion to Scotland's internationally recognised affordable housing supply programme, which this year £725 million affordable housing budget feeds into, despite a 3.4% real terms cut in capital funding from the UK Government. The first-time buyer relief, which raises the nil rate band to £175,000, means that the majority of Scotland's first-time buyers pay no land and building transaction tax, the tax which replaced stamp duty, and all other buyers benefit from a tax reduction of £600. All of this, Dr Hutt, is compared with the Levelling Up and Housing Department, which recently handed back £2 billion in funding, including £1.2 billion that was unused from the Help to Buy scheme. Dr Hutt, I would like to ask all here to ponder on the past achievements and future plans for Scottish housing and consider whether some might be applicable in some other parts of the UK. There has been several well-documented attempts in recent times to dilute the devolution settlement and reduce the decision-making powers of the Scottish Government. Of course, I'll give way.
You're making a very powerful contribution, and the contributions with regards to Wales and Scotland, I think, show the progressive, more radical policies. Would the Honourable Gentleman agree with me that if the devolved nations received fair, needs-based funding settlements from UK Government, we could go much further in terms of those radical socialist policies?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend for what she's saying, because in closing, Dr Hutt, it may be that regarding the policy and the cost of living in the private rented sector, the UK Government might do well to follow some of Scotland and Wales' lead, and does the Minister respond positively to those suggestions?